Hey guys, what's up? So in this video, we're looking at React and the best way to learn React. I've been writing it for about 5 years now. All right, so first thing I want to address right off the bat is that if you want to learn React, you have to learn JavaScript first. There's no way around that. You definitely want to spend some time with JavaScript. And it reminds me of this video that I just did, which is the only way to learn JavaScript, which is to go from the lower level, work your way up. And also the point behind the title and the video itself is that simply you're not going to learn anything from a single book or a single tutorial series. You are going to pick up pieces of this and that as you go along. And for a lot of people that don't work in the development field, they do have to rely on books and tutorials. And there's really nothing wrong with that, but you do want to branch off and actually build your own stuff, which is kind of the point of the video. Just start from the lower levels, really start building things, and don't rely so much on the tutorials. And it's not to say that there's not some really good content on places like Pluralsight and YouTube. There's people that do really good tutorial series. But for me, I just simply rely on the official documentation these days because that's the best place to go. By the time books are printed, they're already out of date, and it's always been that way for the most part. And nowadays with JavaScript and these new libraries and languages and stuff, it's much easier to dive into the official documentation. And then where that fails you, for me, personally speaking, I end up going to Stack Overflow. All right, guys, so the next big subject is whether or not you should use TypeScript in order to write your React code. And when you're just getting started with React, I personally think that TypeScript is probably an unnecessary learning curve to throw in. Although I write TypeScript every day now. I've been doing that for years. So I use TypeScript all the time. I like it. And I also write a lot of just raw JavaScript too. So they're very interchangeable. You'll see as you learn both of them. But really TypeScript adds an additional learning curve. So in my opinion, I would probably just scrap that and focus just on React. If you're just moving from JavaScript and trying to figure out what are you going to do next, I would go JavaScript probably, then React. And then once you get a foothold there, I might go ahead and start doing some basic TypeScript and then seeing if you can do that with React. But you're going to find more React documentation and questions written in raw JavaScript versus TypeScript. All right, guys, so I'm going to jump into the tooling. Now, as far as tooling is concerned for React, there's nothing in particular that you need in order to get everything set up. Everything is open source and available and free for you to use, so you don't have to pay for anything in order to actually develop professional React code. My recommendation is for Visual Studio Code, just because there's a lot of plugins and extensions for it that make setting up your entire React ecosystem a lot easier. All right, guys, so the next piece of advice is that you do have to understand what Webpack is used for. These bundling projects, that they basically take your code and they bundle it all into one file. And where most people think it's just with JavaScript that you bundle a bunch of separate JavaScript files into one massive JavaScript file, it actually does more than that these days. It's actually doing all kinds of stuff from taking images and putting them in certain directories. You can actually do code splitting, so you can configure this thing any way that you want, so that every time you're compiling your project, that an entire series of events and things take place in order for your entire application to get situated the way that it needs to be. And with modern day development in JavaScript, ever since we really started having these module importing capabilities, this is how we develop everything, and it makes much more sense because we can create all kinds of separate JavaScript files, and then as we need them, we import them. But instead of having to figure out the order in which that they're imported, Webpack does all that for us. The downside is that there is a pretty decent learning curve with Webpack. All right, guys, so the next thing you need to know in order to get started with React is that most people are using Node.js to install React. And although you can actually use just simple script include files if you go to React's website, that is not the preferred method of doing it. No companies are writing their React code that way. So you probably want to get familiar with Node.js, because if you download this, then you're going to have a package manager called NPM. And NPM, although there are competitors like Yarn, NPM is probably still the most popular version, and this is just a package manager tool. So what it does is it reaches across the internet and it will download all the different projects you need for the Node ecosystem. And there are actually two separate projects with React, and those two projects are React DOM and then the actual React project. And the reason why those were spun off is because of a project called React Native. When React Native came along to develop mobile applications using the React ecosystem, they decided to branch off the React that actually deals with DOM manipulation, and that stands for Document Object Model, which is what we call all elements. And really, anytime if you want to see what the Document Object Model is, you simply just right-click on any web page, say Inspect if you're on Chrome, and if you go to the Elements tab, all this is your DOM. This is called the DOM, and it just consists of a bunch of different HTML elements. And the React DOM project, essentially all you use it for is to just render the DOM. But it is a completely separate maintained project, and they spun it off because of the React Native project. All right, so the next thing is your typical React project looks something like this. This is actually a full web framework right here, and React is not a full web framework. It's just for the view for MVC. So technically React is more of a library and not a framework as compared to something like Angular. So in this particular example, what I did is I just cloned my project from GitHub, which is called Bare Bones React, that has just a working implementation. But there's other projects as well, like Create a React App, which I felt like was a little too bloated, but it does have a lot more than what this project has, that's why I called it Bare Bones, just trying to get the minimal type of setup for both server side and for client side. So now if you wanted to get started with a starter project that is out there, like Create a React App or Bare Bones React or something like that, you just need to have Node installed. You clone the project to your computer, and then in my case I went ahead and CD'd into the folder here, so I'm in the terminal and you can see all the files are here. And then if I just run npm install, this will actually go through and install all the dependencies that I have. So I have a bunch of different dependencies. If you look here, these are all for the development of the application itself, and then you have the actual core dependencies that your website will actually need in order to function. And for a standard React application, you at least need React and React DOM, those two separate projects I just mentioned. All right, so now that I have everything installed, I went ahead and I ran this application, and it consists of both a server side using Node Express on the server that your customers are going to have a browser and they connect to your server, and your server returns a bunch of code. That is going to be handled by Node and Express because that's not what React does. And then React is actually building this entire view that we're looking at right now. And how does all that happen? It's actually through a combination of, really it's through the use of components. Everything in React is a component. This is the main starting point of my application, which is called this index.js file. It's just the starting point. Here I'm actually importing React DOM, and I'm using it to render the DOM. This is the only time I use React DOM in the entire project, and it's just simply delivering this home component. And the home component is being loaded from pages home. So if I click on this here, this is the actual component that is providing everything that you just saw when we looked at the website. So it's loading the logo, which is its own separate component, which is found here. I base64 encoded the image, so I didn't have to have an external image, if you guys are wondering what that is all about. But then like here's your header, and then the navigation for the website. So all this stuff is not exactly HTML, and this is the next point that I want to get into. One of the hardest things about getting started with React is that when you go to render something, you're actually returning a combination of HTML/JavaScript, which is called JSX. And forewarning, I hated JSX when I was first getting started with it. I actually tried to use JSX. It took me and not until my third separate attempt of learning JSX, after scrapping it and saying, oh, I hate this stuff, I don't like it. They used to tell us we had to separate our concerns, and you never mix JavaScript with HTML and all this other stuff, and you shouldn't have inline CSS styling on your components versus an external style sheet. So JSX sort of kind of broke convention, and it wasn't until I really started learning it and understanding it that I realized the power behind it. So this is something that you're probably going to struggle with out of the gate. It looks like HTML, but it's not quite. One of the first things you might notice is that it has this class name. So there is no class. Normally you would just put a class. Now in JSX, though, we have to say class name, and it has to be camel case, meaning every subsequent word is capitalized. Through a combination of a lot of different tooling that this project is using, as well as Webpack, what is happening is that all that stuff is compiling the code into something else, and it's actually building real HTML. So here you can see where we used to have class name everywhere. This is actually, we used to have class name, but you can see that it returns actual class. So let me try to go back here real quick. So I'm trying to get it, like, here's this list unstyled. Let's find that. So here's the class name, and what it turns it to is right here, list unstyled. It just turns it to a simple class. So that's your JSX at work. So one of the hard things to wrap your head around, and you're probably like, why do I need JSX and all this other stuff? But React is a component-based structure. Everything in React is a component, similar to like Python, the language, everything is an object. React has standard components, and what you end up doing is you design your application, your entire UI, React UI and everything, and you design it in a component-based system. So you're going to have one outer component. For this basic example, my outer component is the main starting component. It's home. Everything is wrapped inside this home component. So going back, this outer would be the home, and then any sort of internal stuff, whether it's the navigation, like footers, logos, all that stuff is all wrapped up inside of here. So when we look at the official documentation, one of the reasons for this is because you have ways of communicating with components and passing data to them, and you use that, and the way you do that is through these things called props. And props are really just HTML attributes, but you can embed them right into the JSX code. So that's what makes JSX so much more effective than writing actual raw JavaScript to do the same thing. Technically, all this is just returning a JavaScript function that's building your HTML, but React does that for you. All right, so the next thing I want to discuss is that React has something called a unidirectional data flow, which means that the data flows from the top down and it only goes in one direction. Whereas if you have a bidirectional data flow, then you could have components that are in their children changing data from their parents. React does not do it that way. The architecture says, hey, the parent has to decide what data to pass to the children, and they do it by passing the data via props. And when that data changes, React will re-render itself. So it's all handled for you automatically, but the data goes downhill. So it starts from home, and like in our example, if I want to pass some data to nav, I can do that via a prop, and we'll see an example right now. So to see an example of this in action, what we can do is we can say my prop, and then here you just simply assign some data. This could be any data you want. Anything inside curly braces within JSX is actually treated as actual raw JavaScript. So like if I had some sort of variable here, I could create a variable like let my var equals testing 1 2 3. All right, so I have this this variable here, and I can go ahead and assign it just like that. So now I can actually reference my prop within my props. That's a terrible name, I know, but like from now inside home though, I can go ahead and say, you know what, let me go ahead and say I'm going to put an h1 in here, a header tag, and then for its data I want to say this dot props dot, what was the name of it, my prop. Terrible name again, but what I did is from the outer component, the actual main component of this application, which is home, I went ahead and I attached a my prop to and I assigned this variable. So testing 1 2 3 now goes into home, and we're going to render it right here. And now when we look at our website, we can see testing 1 2 3 is injected right into the site. Now I could even pass that further down. I could even say, you know what, pass further is the name of this prop, and I'm going to say, you know what, I want it to be this dot props dot my prop. So instead of referencing it here, what I did is I went ahead and I passed it down to another child, which is the nav. So now if we wanted to go over to our nav, we can do that. And you know, where I have, let's see, where I have the title now, I can go ahead and just reference this dot props dot, I don't even remember what I called it, props dot pass further. All right. And now you can see that the application has testing 1 2 3 as its title and not bare bones React. So essentially the way that you need to look at this is that your outer component is typically the one that is communicating with the database, with the server, I should say the server, usually through an AJAX call or something like that. But that outer component most likely is going to be handling the majority of your data. And what it'll do is it then passes that data down. And every time React picks up on the fact that the data has changed, it will re-render all of its children with the new data. So all the props, this could be like a dynamic value where you could have some code right here, communicating with the server like every 5 seconds or something like that, pulling back new data and assigning it all via the props. And then as everything changes, it gets re-rendered in real time and you don't have to do anything further. All right, guys, so the next thing to keep in mind is that the typical server-side stack, which this is a server, this is part of the server code, which is part of Express and Node, and all this stuff is actually on GitHub if you guys want to follow along with it. But here's where you can create a new endpoint, so I can go ahead and define my endpoint, really not use, I'm going to say git. And here, this could be, we'll just call it data, right? And then what you need to do is you're going to return a function that has a request and a response object in it. And then we could say response.json and then just pass back an actual JavaScript JSON object. So we'll say band Bayside. I really should say my dog, but anyway. So this is the way of being able to return actual JSON data from your server-side app. So now that we have that new endpoint here, I could go /data, and here you can see we're returning an actual JSON object. So if we inspect and we look at the network and refresh, you can see the call that's being made right here, and you can see the headers, and it says, hey, what am I returning back? Application JSON. All that stuff is done for you. It's real easy. Here's the data here. This could most likely, from your server side, most likely this type of functionality here is not going to be hard-coded in your server-side app. It's probably going to be a database connection or something, and it's going to grab whatever sort of JSON data. But when you're dealing with React applications, you want to use JSON data, which is really just JavaScript objects of key value pairs. And the value of the key could be anything from strings, numbers, arrays, and you could get really, really complicated JSON data, but that is what React excels at. In fact, any client-side library, whether it's Vue, Angular, or React, they all want to deal with JSON data. So like that's kind of how you want to be structuring your data, whether you're hitting it from a SQL server or a MySQL or something else. Most likely you're going to take your data, turn it into a JSON object, and then you're going to return that as a response to whatever sort of endpoint that you want to hit. All right, guys, so to see that AJAX call in action, to give you guys an idea of what I'm talking about, we can use the new fetch library, which returns promises. And what we can do is say, go ahead and hit up that data endpoint that we just defined. Then we're going to say .then. After you've done that, we're going to say take the response of that. And this is a function that we're going to execute once we get a response back. We want to say return the response.json data. But then we need another .then here to then handle the response of that call. So we're going to say we're going to get some JSON data back. So I'll just call it JSON. And then what I want to do is I don't want React DOM to render until this promise call is made. So what I'm going to do is just nest that inside of here. And then I can go ahead and reference this JSON data that's being brought back by saying JSON.band, which was the name of our data that we defined in the server, so band. So how do I get that? I do it through a series of calls here. So really, this can honestly not even be a variable. It doesn't need to be a variable. It could just be simply a fetch like this. And now, as you can see, we have the title being dynamic data that we pass down from the server. All right, guys, so the last thing I'm going to touch upon, and there's a lot more with React. In fact, if you guys are interested in learning more about React, I have several tutorial series that are out. I have some on Udemy, but I'm also producing some new content as well. So I'll make sure that I update the link in the description tab as soon as the course is available for you guys. But it'll go into it'll go into in much more depth with everything with React that I cannot possibly cover in one single introductory video. All right, guys, so the last thing you need to know is about state. And it's very similar to props, but state is any sort of variable or data points that you have that are going to be very dynamic. They change all the time. They change based on a mouse cursor hovering over something, or they change based on some sort of AJAX call, whatever it may be. If the value changes, you can't put it in props. Don't put it in props. That's not how it works. Props is for basically immutable data, so data is not going to change. But if you need the component to re-render itself, and like I said, not just a parent component passing props to a child, because that's going to re-render the child every time. I'm talking about that particular child component needs to go ahead and update itself, and there's some sort of dynamic value. Well, then that's when you use state. So every React component has the ability to manage its own state. And to see that in action here, what we're going to do is we're going to define the state inside of our home component. But like I said, every component has the ability to have its own state inside of it. But what you need to do is you need to have a constructor function in here that actually takes in props. And then what you do, you go into here. What I want to do is just call super props. I'll explain that in my tutorial series, but for right now, you do need to call that. And then this is where we can go ahead and define our state. And we're just going to say it equals a JavaScript object. And then here we can have, I'll just call it dynamic value. And then I'll put my name in here for right now. So this could be a bunch of key value pairs. But if we wanted to reference it from within our component, I'm going to say this.state versus props. And then I just give the name of the key. All right, so now you can see that the title is Chris. It's that dynamic value that we've just assigned via state. So now if I wanted to see this value change, what I can do is we're going to go ahead and just add a button with an on-click event inline. And this is very similar, like I said, with the camel casing for JSX, but we can go ahead and just simply return an inline function right in here and say this.setState. And we're going to change that dynamic value to be something called changed. All right, and since this is a button, let's go ahead and close off our button. And then we're going to say click me to change the state. All right, and let's go ahead and take a look at it. All right, so here's our button that we just added. And if I click it, we just changed the state. So that's pretty sweet. And again, we refresh it, and you can see that has changed. All right, guys, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this video. If you guys are interested in learning more, learning about React, ASP.NET, Python, C#, all kinds of stuff, I have a lot of different tutorials available on Udemy, and I'm working with a few other platforms as well. And I'm also going to be releasing a lot more tutorial series to YouTube, which I've sort of taken a break from. But definitely, it would be helping me out if you guys check out my Udemy stuff, because I do have a lot of my full feature courses there. And it's I'm actually like just getting started with that, so I can't wait to actually build this next React course that's going to be like more full scale. You guys are going to see pretty much everything that React has to offer in that course. So as soon as it's available, I'll make sure I update the link in the description tab. In the meantime, I do have other courses available on Udemy, so make sure you guys check that out. And let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to reach out, and I'll do my best to try to reach back to you guys. Make sure you guys take care and have a good day. Bye.